In the year 1812, a young United States of America declared war on the British Empire and launched a full-scale invasion of Canada. No one expected the poorly defended British colony to hold out against a much larger American foe, and yet it did. Canada's salvation came arguably in the form of one man, Tecumseh. He was fighting for his people, the indigenous tribes of North America. His alliance with the British was out of convenience alone, and his true goal was simple: to create a united native nation across the American frontier and retake the land that had been lost. Welcome to our video on the life of Tecumseh. Shout out to the Ridge Wallet for sponsoring this video. Members of our team have been using Ridge Wallets for more than a year now, and we recommend them to all of our viewers. They don't fold, don't bulge in your pocket, and are light, with a modern, sleek and industrial design. Ridge Wallets are a great Christmas gift for you and your loved ones. Ridge holds up to 12 cards and has an attached money clip for cash. It comes in 30 different colors and styles, including our favorites, carbon fiber and burnt titanium. For us, switching from the old wallets to Ridge was like going from an old chair to a super fancy gaming armchair. But don't take our word for it, Ridge has 40,000 5-star reviews. Each wallet comes with a lifetime warranty, and the Ridge team is so confident that you'll like it that they'll let you try it for 45 days. If you don't love it, just send it back and get a full refund. Support our channel and get 10% off today with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/kingsandgenerals and using code KINGSandGenerals. To tell Tecumseh's story from the very beginning, we must explain the world he was born into. Native tribes had inhabited North America for over 12,000 years, but diseases brought upon them by Europeans had apocalyptic effects on their society. By the time the first English pilgrims arrived at Plymouth Rock in 1620, a smallpox epidemic had killed 90% of the local population. By the 18th century, the eastern seaboard was dominated by Britain's 13 colonies, with tribes like the Pequot, Powhatan and Massachusetts all but wiped out and pushed out of their homes. Now, peoples like the Odawas, Shawnees, Lenape and the powerful Iroquois Confederacy were on the border of this expansion. Further inland, the French Empire claimed a vast swath of territory from Labrador to Louisiana. It was a sparsely populated land where native tribes exercised full autonomy and were more or less equal partners in the incredibly lucrative fur trade. The French tended not to impose on native territory, and their presence provided a buffer against British expansion. This all changed in 1754, as when the 7 Years' War erupted in North America, England and France found themselves in a war for dominance over the New World, and the natives were forced to pick sides. The 6 nations of the Iroquois declared for England, but nearly all the other local tribes fought alongside the French. The French were ultimately defeated and their territory annexed. The British now ventured inland, occupying formerly French forts along the Great Lakes and Ohio. It was well known that, unlike the French, the British did not come to trade furs, but to flatten and tame the land and displace the natives who hunted and gathered there. As settlers began to trickle westwards and British soldiers treated the locals with contempt, whispers of war began to spread amongst the tribes of the Old Northwest. In 1763, the Odawa chieftain Pontiac created an alliance of 14 tribes and proceeded to wage a bloody and vengeful war upon the British. His native confederacy raised hell, capturing 8 forts along the Great Lakes, killing over 2,000 settlers and 400 soldiers. Pontiac's fierce resistance forced the British to pull back and reaffirm an earlier treaty in which the 13 colonies promised not to settle land west of the Allegheny Mountains. Peace was made in 1766, and the tide of expansion had been stemmed for now, but war would soon come to native peoples once more. 2 years later, the man fated to lead them into battle entered the world. In March of 1768, Tecumseh was born to the Shawnee people in a village along the Ohio River. It is said that upon giving birth, his mother looked to the heavens and saw a comet blazing across the night sky. This is where the child got his name, Tecumseh, the shooting star. The Shawnee had long been a wandering people, beset by conflicts with other tribes. In centuries past, the Iroquois had pushed them eastward from their old territory. They had settled in many places before coming to their present spot along the Ohio River, but turmoil and warfare would carry over into Tecumseh's childhood. In the same year he was born, the Iroquois sold land in Kentucky and West Virginia to the British. These were plains the Shawnee depended on for hunting, but when they voiced their protests, they were ignored both by the British and the Iroquois. So, when continental settlers began pouring westward into their newly purchased territory, Shawnee warriors prepared to defend their lands. In 1774, a 6-year-old Tecumseh watched his father Puckeshinwau and his eldest brother Cheeseekau partake in a ritual war dance before heading away to battle. They met their foe at Point Pleasant, a force of Virginia militiamen, who the natives called the Big Knives on account of the sabres worn by the colonial officers. Outnumbered and outgunned, the native warriors were driven back. As a result, the Shawnee were forced to relinquish their hunting grounds, allowing the settlers to move westward with impunity. Tecumseh's father was mortally wounded in the battle. With his dying breath, he beseeched his firstborn son to preserve the dignity of his family line and one day lead his younger brothers into battle. The news of Puckeshinwau's death devastated Tecumseh's mother, who was pregnant with the last of his children. It was no less hard upon the boy himself. Fatherless at 6 years old, his family was uprooted and forced to move west. That winter, his mother gave birth to triplets. Of the 2 that survived, one was named Lalawethika. Initially a useless layabout, the sickly boy would later have a profound impact on Tecumseh's life. A year later, the 13 colonies declared their independence from the British Empire, plunging the region into war and imposing a new threat upon native peoples. As the Revolutionary War raged between patriot and loyalist, many native bands now joined the fray on the side of the British Crown. Among them were the Shawnee, who sought to reclaim the lands lost to the now rebellious frontiersmen. This invoked the ire of the Americans, who responded wrathfully, sending soldiers into Shawnee lands. Before long, a large band of Kentucky militia were advancing upon Tecumseh's village. Still too young to fight, Tecumseh had fled alongside the women and children to nearby bluffs, while the warriors of the village tried to hold off the militia, to no avail. It was not the first time Tecumseh was forced to move, but this time he was there to see his village burn, witnessing with his own eyes the destruction caused by the Big Knives. Never again would Tecumseh sit idly by while his people's land was ravaged. In the years that followed, Tecumseh began training to become the warrior his father had wanted him to be. His eldest brother, Cheeseekau, took full responsibility for his younger brother's growth, obeying his dying father's last wish. Tecumseh was taught how to hunt, how to fight, and how to live as a Shawnee warrior should. When he entered adolescence, Cheeseekau blackened Tecumseh's face and sent him alone into the woods to find his guardian spirit. Tecumseh fasted and meditated, and his spirit came to him in a vision. He never revealed to anyone what form his ethereal guardian took. Tecumseh soon matured into a strong, intelligent young man. Allegedly, he once slew 16 bison with only a bow and a single quiver of arrows. He also drew no small amount of attention from the opposite sex. The women of the Shawnee were very fond of Tecumseh, but he did not indulge in their attention, often brushing off their advances. Tecumseh's first taste of battle came in 1786. The young warrior confronted a host of Big Knives alongside Cheeseekau and a host of Shawnee warriors at Mad River, Ohio. When the Americans fired a musket volley across the river, Tecumseh's nerve broke and he panicked and ran. He had failed his first test as a warrior. He was disgusted with himself and vowed to never show cowardice again. The following years saw Tecumseh come into his own as a capable warrior, albeit still in the shadow of his eldest brother. Continued conflict with the United States seemed inevitable. The young nation was burgeoning and hungry for expansion. Many tribes were resolved to do whatever was necessary to stop colonial encroachment onto their land. In 1785, this tension evolved into a prolonged frontier conflict known to the Americans as the Northwest Indian War. Rarely able to take on the US Army head-on, many native warbands resorted to hit-and-run tactics. By 1788, Tecumseh and Cheeseekau were involved in more than their fair share of skirmishes. Initially camped on the Ohio River, the two brothers and their band of warriors habitually raided the flatboats that traversed the busy thoroughfare. These boats carried food, provisions, and settlers, and their waylaying discouraged many from entering native land. During this turbulent period of his life, Tecumseh began to see the world in a new way. He was fighting alongside not just the Shawnee, but also Cherokees, Mingos, and Delawares. He began to see himself as a native first and a Shawnee second, and realized that his people would never be free of the yoke of colonialism unless they banded together as one. He began to detest the idea that any one tribe could sell land to the whites, whatever the consequences it brought upon other tribes. Tecumseh came to the revelation that land belonged to no one band, but to all native peoples. Thus, he began to dream of a united and independent nation held together by a shared indigenous identity. In 1791, an alliance of tribes formed to push the Americans back east of the Ohio River. Led by the Little Turtle of the Miami and Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, they fell upon a force of 1,000 US soldiers camped at the Wabash River and massacred them. It is to this day the single greatest victory won alone by native peoples against the Americans. Tecumseh was not at the battle at the Wabash, but certainly took part in the increased back-and-forth raiding that followed in its wake. In September of 1792, Tecumseh and Cheeseekau joined a war party of Cherokees and Creeks and launched an assault upon Buchanan Station in Tennessee. From inside a stockaded blockhouse, 20 frontiersmen were able to hold off 300 native warriors. In this fateful battle, Cheeseekau was slain, shot dead by an American soldier through a porthole, while Tecumseh managed to retreat with his life. The loss of his older brother fell hard upon the young Shawnee, but Cheeseekau had accomplished what his dying father had beseeched he do all those years ago. Among many native groups, leadership was not determined through formal appointment, but by earning the respect of one's peers. In the years that followed Cheeseekau's death, Tecumseh had become a fighter of great renown and began to accumulate a small warband loyal to him. By 1794, the Northwest Indian War was nearing its climax. Tecumseh and his warriors joined forces with the Confederacy led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, forming a combined army of 1,300 men. Fighting alongside them was a British-led contingent of Canadian militias who had a vested interest in undermining American influence in the region. Together, they faced an army of 2,000 American soldiers on the bank of the Maumee River. In what would later be known as the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the natives were overwhelmed by American gunfire and attempted to retreat behind the walls of the British-held Fort Miami. The British would not let them in, not willing to risk all-out war with the US. Facing a massacre, the natives were forced to scatter. The betrayal Tecumseh suffered at the hands of the British was one he would not forget. The engagement at the Fallen Timbers ended the 10-year frontier war, and the United States finally managed to impose their sovereignty over the Old Northwest. Native leaders were compelled to sign the Treaty of Greenville, a document that forced them to recognize large chunks of Ohio and the Great Lakes as American soil. Tecumseh was disgusted by this capitulation and stubbornly refused to sign the treaty. Instead, he retreated with his followers to Buck Creek, where he founded a village. For the next 10 years, Tecumseh bided his time, waiting for the opportunity in which he could make his dream a reality, a dream of a united, self-sufficient native nation. That opportunity would arrive in 1805, when Tecumseh's laggard of a younger brother received a vision from the Great Spirit. The idler, known as Lalawethika, would transform into Tenskwatawa, the Great Prophet, and lead a religious revival that would bring together tribes from all corners of the American frontier. By the turn of the 19th century, it was clear that the Americans' hunger for territory had not been sated. The Louisiana Purchase, which saw a massive stretch of land sold by the French to the United States, all but confirmed that further ingress into native inhabited lands was inevitable. In the aftermath of their victory in the Northwest Indian War, over 600,000 American pioneers would settle in the newly established states of Kentucky and Ohio, as well as the territory of Indiana, land once dominated by native tribes. Disunited and outnumbered, the natives of the frontier were direly outmatched. Despite this, Tecumseh never gave up his grand ambitions to retake native territories. As fate would have it, it would actually be his brother who would spark the movement that would snowball into the creation of his great confederacy. This man was Lalawethika, meaning he who makes a loud noise. He had always been the black sheep of the family, having never become a great warrior like his brothers. A freak accident had taken out his eye when he was young, and he spent the majority of his youth as a perpetually drunk good-for-nothing. In the year 1805, everything changed. One day, Lalawethika was smoking in his wigwam when suddenly his body seized up and he fell into a trance. His stupor was so deep that those around him thought he had died, yet soon he awoke as a changed man. Lalawethika told everyone that he had received a vision from the Great Spirit, in which he had seen his people led onto a path of doom, and was now convinced that the Great Spirit had sent him on a mission to purify native culture for their salvation. He took on a new name, Tenskwatawa, the Open Door. In time, he became known to his people as the Prophet. The Prophet soon began spreading his teachings amongst the Shawnee. He preached that his people were the Great Spirit's original creations. In contrast, the white people were children of the evil spirit that grew from the scum of the great waters. As such, natives bore an innate responsibility to keep their way of life pure of colonial influence. To this endeavor, he denounced intermarriage between natives and whites, which had become commonplace in the last few decades. He spoke out against alcoholism and forbade the evils of drink. He renounced European clothing and other such innovations brought to his lands since first contact, mandating his followers wear the traditional garments of their people. In the winter of 1805, a familiar calamity struck the Old Northwest. Native communities were once more afflicted by an outbreak of smallpox, leaving many communities crippled or entirely depopulated. Disease had sadly become old news to the natives by this point, who often coped by blaming their misfortune on witches, who supposedly were sinister herbalists capable of brewing malicious potions and spreading illness. Thus, in the spring of 1806, the Prophet became a major ringleader in a witch hunt that spread across the Old Northwest, a hunt he used to further spread the influence of his religious movement. Tenskwatawa hounded down all those who denounced him and all who embraced the ways of the white man. Under his watch, Christian natives and chieftains friendly to the Americans were captured, tortured, and killed, all in the name of rooting allegedly evil witches out of native communities. The Prophet soon had a growing following, not just among the Shawnee, but many neighboring tribes as well. The growing unrest in the native Northwest began to make American settlers on the frontier uneasy. One such man was William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory. He had fought in the Northwest Indian Wars a decade earlier, and a religious uprising centered around resisting colonialism was a threat to the settlers in his jurisdiction. Seeking to pacify the movement, Harrison denounced Tenskwatawa to the Delawares with conviction, saying, "Who is this pretended prophet who dares to speak in the name of the great Creator? Is he more wise or virtuous than you are yourselves, that he should convey to you the orders of your God?" To affirm his spiritual powers, the prophet told his followers of a day of black sun. He was correct. By accurately predicting a solar eclipse, Tenskwatawa had proven his power in the eyes of his followers. In 1808, the prophet joined forces with Tecumseh. Together, the two brothers founded a village upon the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. The old chieftain, Little Turtle, who had fought at Fallen Timbers, warned Tecumseh that he was settling on the lands of the Miami, to which Tecumseh replied devoutly that he was settling on native lands. The brothers' village came to be known as Prophetstown, and would serve as the staging point for their pan-native resistance movement. In the following years, people from all over the Old Northwest filtered into Prophetstown, drawn to Tenskwatawa's teachings and Tecumseh's reputation as a warrior. The community grew quickly from a small village into a bustling multi-tribal township, a hub of Native American cultural and political activity. In the end, it was Tecumseh who assumed the ultimate chieftaincy of their budding community. Tecumseh soon set out from Prophetstown on a mission to convince the tribes of the Old Northwest that resistance, not assimilation, was the key to their survival, and to build a confederacy that stretched across the American frontier. The chieftain traveled from village to village, dazzling people with his charismatic orations and legendary strength. Chieftains of the Ojibwe, Wyandots, Fox, Sauk, Odawas, Kickapoos, Lenape, Miami, Seneca, Onondaga, and Delawares all joined his cause, as of course did the Shawnee. But Tecumseh was not all honeyed words. He imposed himself harshly, threatening death to any chiefs who collaborated with the Americans. Meanwhile, as more tribes joined Tecumseh's cause, more and more natives migrated into Prophetstown, which had evolved into the center of the Native Confederacy, a swelling city-state that provided a powerful buffer against white settlers' westward expansion. The rapid growth of Tecumseh's Confederacy, its active anti-colonial rhetoric, and its existence within lands claimed by the United States put it on an inevitable collision course with the Americans. The catalyst of this confrontation came in 1809, when Governor Harrison of Indiana coerced select chieftains of the Delaware, Potawatomi, and Kickapoo to sign the Treaty of Fort Wayne, which ceded a 12,000 square kilometer piece of land along the Wabash River to the United States government. This treaty infuriated Tecumseh, as it flew right in the face of his core belief that land belonged collectively to all natives. He saw it as theft, a plain and simple attempt to extort weak chieftains whose land had been made poor by white settlers. In August of 1810, Tecumseh met with Harrison face to face outside the governor's colonial estate, and the two engaged in a heated parley. Tecumseh insisted that native land could not be bought or sold, unless done so collectively by all the tribes acting as one, and that the land ceded to the Americans in the recent treaties still rightfully belonged to the natives. Harrison replied that individual tribes were free to make treaties with the United States, but Tecumseh's confederacy was not recognized, nor did the local tribes welcome his interference in their affairs. The back-and-forth debate inspired a passionate reply from Tecumseh and his most iconic quote, "Sell a country? Why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children?" Tensions soon grew between the two parties. Harrison was quick to point out that the Shawnee themselves had taken land from the Miamis, so what right had they to dictate the affairs of other tribes? If the tribes were all one nation, as Tecumseh claimed, why did the Great Spirit not have them all speak one language? Tecumseh lost his temper, declaring that everything Harrison said was a lie and that the Americans had cheated the native peoples. He brandished his tomahawk at the governor, prompting Harrison to draw his saber and point it at Tecumseh. A tense standoff ensued, but neither side attacked. Harrison brought the meeting to an end and demanded Tecumseh and his followers leave. Tecumseh soon realized he had been wrong to threaten Harrison, and the two met once more the following day, this time at the Shawnees' camp. This time Tecumseh opted for a more diplomatic route. He offered the United States alliance against Britain, but only if they would renounce their claim to native lands purchased in recent treaties. Harrison replied cordially, saying he would present Tecumseh's terms to the president, but did not expect the natives' conditions to be met. To this, Tecumseh replied regretfully, "I hope the great chief will give up this land. He is so far off, he may sit still and drink his wine, whilst you and I will have to fight it out." Harrison was impressed by the integrity of his enemy. He remarked that, if it were not for the vicinity of the United States, he would perhaps be the founder of an empire. In 1811, Tecumseh travelled southwards to present-day Alabama. The natives of that region were known to the Americans as the Five Civilized Tribes, due to their more positive predisposition to adopting European practices. Tecumseh's goal was to extend his alliance along the entirety of the American frontier, but he met fierce resistance in the south. The tribes there rejected his calls for unity more often than not, instead preferring to abide by the treaties they had signed with the United States. This is exemplified in an exchange between Tecumseh and Pushmataha, a chieftain of the Choctaws. Pushmataha stood firm against Tecumseh, delivering a pithy statement. "These white Americans give us fair exchange, their cloth, their guns, their tools, implements, and other things which the Choctaws need but do not make. It will be seen that the whites and Indians in this section are living on friendly and mutually beneficial terms." Tecumseh delivered a vehement reply. "Where today are the Pequot? Where are the Narragansett, the Mochican, the Poccanet, and other powerful tribes of our people? They have vanished before the avarice and oppression of the white man. Sleep not longer, O Choctaws and Chickasaws. Will not the bones of our dead be ploughed up, and their graves turned into ploughed fields?" Unfortunately, his words fell on deaf ears, and the Choctaws refused to join his cause. Nevertheless, Tecumseh did find limited success in the south. In September, he rode into the Muskogee town of Tuckabashie. There he delivered another impassioned speech about the unity of natives and resistance against the white man. Thousands of warriors raised their tomahawks and cheered, but one old chieftain remained silent. One story claims that Tecumseh stalked over to this chieftain and declared that he would march to Fort Detroit, stamp his foot into the earth, and shake down every house in Tuckabashie to prove that he had been chosen by the Great Spirit. Tecumseh then ventured back northwards, and sure enough, on December 16, 1811, the New Madrid earthquake rocked the southern United States, and every house in Tuckabashie was shaken to its foundations. Many interpreted this as the coming of Tecumseh's prophecy and proof they should join his confederacy. Henceforth, a significant amount of Muskogees declared themselves for Tecumseh, a faction which became known as the Red Sticks. Meanwhile, in Indiana, Governor Harrison was aware that Tecumseh was away from Prophetstown, which was currently under the administration of Tenskwatawa. Harrison knew that Tecumseh was the main military power in the native confederacy, and his absence made this the right time to strike. Harrison's goal was to conquer Prophetstown, thereby ripping the heart out of the growing confederacy and eliminating the threat of a native invasion of Indiana before it could begin. Harrison sent the Prophet an ultimatum. All Potawatomis, Kickapoos, and Winnebagos were to be expelled from Prophetstown. All warriors who had launched raids upon United States citizens had to be surrendered, and all goods and horses stolen from settlers had to be returned. These terms served to effectively disband the native confederacy, and unsurprisingly were unilaterally rejected. On September 20th, 1811, Harrison marched northwards with an army of 1,000 men. Comprising this force were 325 Army regulars and 625 volunteers, largely from Kentucky and the Indiana Territory. The militia was made up primarily of infantrymen, but also featured mounted sharpshooters and dragoons. The principal weapon used by this expeditionary force was the Model 1795 Springfield flintlock musket, a firearm capable of discharging 3 rounds per minute. The army stopped at present-day Terre Haute, Indiana, and constructed a stockade named Fort Harrison, which would be a staging point for their upcoming assault. Within their town, the Prophet's warriors numbered anywhere from 500 to 700, divided into tribal contingents of Winnebagos, Kickapoos, Potawatomis, Wyandots, and Shawnees, each numbering about 125 men. Most of the natives were armed with British Brown Bess muskets and carried knives, tomahawks, and war clubs. By November 6th, the Americans had advanced out of Fort Harrison and made camp on a high ridge around 1,000 yards west of Prophetstown. Before he had headed south, Tecumseh had warned his brother not to engage in combat, for he did not want open war before his confederacy was fully mobilized. Despite this, he was not present, and the warriors of Prophetstown looked to Tenskwatawa for guidance. The Prophet had made overtures for peace that afternoon, but this was a fruitless endeavour, as Harrison could not accept any terms short of the abandonment of Prophetstown and the dispersal of its inhabitants. Meanwhile, the natives had become deeply uneased by the army at their doorstep, and many itched for confrontation. The most popular story claims the Winnebago faction denounced any attempt at peace and demanded Tenskwatawa send them into battle. Thus, the Prophet sought a vision with the Great Spirit and returned to his warriors with a plan to assassinate Governor Harrison, thereby beheading the American army and making them unable to fight. The Winnebagos demanded that the attack had to be that night. Thus, Tenskwatawa invoked his shamanic powers to confer with the Great Spirit, promising that the elimination of Harrison could be carried out via a nighttime assault upon the American camp. Thus, at 4 AM on the morning of November 7th, the war chiefs began their attack, having been given the blessing of their prophet. They advanced upon the American camp in a crescent formation. The right horn was made up of Kickapoos, led by Chief Mengoatoa, the left made up of Winnebagos, led by Chief Waweapakusa, and the centre made up of Potawatomis, led by Roundhead and Wabaunsi. The plan was to have the Kickapoos infiltrate the camp's northeastern corner and slay Harrison under the cover of darkness, at which point they would signal the rest of the warriors and massacre the US soldiers. This would not come to pass, for Harrison was a shrewd commander and knew well not to underestimate his native foes. Remembering all too well how 1,000 US soldiers had been massacred at the ambush at the Wabash back in 1791, he had ordered the tents in his camp to be set up in a crescent formation and for his men to sleep on top of their muskets, which were to be loaded with their bayonets affixed. The Kickapoos reached the American camp ahead of the other native contingents, crawling on the flats of their stomachs. At around 4:30 AM, they encountered an advance watchman, who managed to fire off a shot before being killed. The crack of the rifle caused the Americans to grow alert, with Harrison himself being awoken by 5:30, by which point the Kickapoos had reached the northwestern edge of the camp. At precisely 5:50, one Corporal Stephen Mars managed to train his sights on a Kickapoo warrior and shoot him dead. The presence of the natives was now known, and they had precious little time before the entire American stockade was alerted. Realizing that an assassination of Harrison was now impossible, the Kickapoos raised their weapons and charged, beginning the battle in earnest. For roughly 15 minutes, the Kickapoos kept the Americans' northwest flank in a state of chaos, killing a handful of soldiers and forcing the 4th Infantry Regiment and Kentucky Riflemen to retreat deeper into their camp. However, Harrison's foresight had paid off, as by 6 AM, all hands in the American camp were alerted and had been assembled into battle positions around the perimeter. It was around this time that the rest of the native warriors arrived on the scene, with the Potawatomis launching an assault on the northwest. The battle had devolved into a slugfest, a contest decided by numbers and firepower. In this, the natives were outmatched. As the hour progressed, the tides began to turn. A company under one Captain Snelling had driven the Potawatomis from the woods, who regrouped and assaulted the northern centre, causing a company led by Captain Robb to collapse and fall back, only to have Snelling's contingent fall in and beat back the ensuing Potawatomi advance. Meanwhile, the Winnebagos struck from the south, engaging in a fierce shootout with the companies of Captain Spencer and Warwick. This too was futile, as Robb's reformed unit arrived to reinforce their compatriots and drive off their enemy. By 7 AM, the sun was beginning to rise, and the natives realized they were outnumbered 2-1. Heavily demoralized, they began retreating back to Prophetstown. Here the Americans launched a counterattack, Fully mobilized and invigorated after repelling an attack, they encircled and charged the fleeing natives, slaying a handful more before the warriors made it back behind the fortifications of Prophetstown. Upon their return, many warriors were outraged at the Prophet, for he had promised them that the Great Spirit had ensured him a victory. The powerful shaman was called out for being a fraud. Many renounced their loyalty to him and deserted Prophetstown. Tenskwatawa made desperate pleas to have them stand and fight, but they fell upon deaf ears. The next morning, the American troops marched into Prophetstown to find it had been abandoned and burned it to the ground. The Prophet, who had laid the groundwork of Tecumseh's confederacy, had lost almost all his influence. The town that served as the heart of native unity had been burned down. This was a harsh blow to the native resistance, but it was not the end. Tecumseh himself still had power, for chieftains of many tribes were still loyal to him. In the face of this setback, he was forced to turn to an old ally against the American threat, the British Empire. On June 17, 1812, the United States Senate voted narrowly in favour of armed conflict with Great Britain. This war had been a long time coming. As a certain Napoleon Bonaparte had been conquering across Europe, the British had imposed themselves upon US sovereignty, embargoing American trade with France and her allies, while kidnapping sailors off American ships to supplement the Royal Navy's perpetual need for manpower. But these were not the real causes of the war. For decades, the British Empire had been empowering native tribes on the US frontier to resist American expansion. Indeed, most of the muskets used by Tecumseh's warriors were British manufactured. For the warhawks in Washington, this provided the excuse needed to pursue American territorial expansion, first by annexing British Canada, then by expanding deeper into the lands of the native tribes on their western frontier. One of the main obstacles preventing American expansionism was still alive and well. Tecumseh had never stopped preparing for war. He had no love for the British, but realized it was only through their manpower and resources that the reconquest of native lands annexed by America and the establishment of an independent pan-tribal native state was possible. To this end, he mobilized his warriors for battle. It was the general consensus that if the United States launched an invasion into Canada, the territory would fall quickly. The ongoing war with Napoleon kept the majority of Britain's armies in Europe, and the local Canadian colonials were unlikely to be willing to fight against a far superior foe. On July 12, 1812, the United States began their invasion when Brigadier General William Hull marched across into Old Sandwich Town in present-day Ontario, occupying it without a fight. He offered peace to the locals should they become Americans, but to those who fought alongside the British or their native allies, he had a much darker promise. The first stroke of the tomahawk, the first attempt with the scalping knife, will be the signal for one indiscriminate scene of desolation. No white man found fighting by the side of an Indian will be taken prisoner. Instant destruction will be his lot. However, Hull proved to be an ineffective general. The main British garrison in the region was isolated in nearby Fort Malden, but Hull refused to strike, instead holding position in Sandwich Town while obsessing over his supply lines across the Detroit River. On July 17th, 700 native warriors of the Great Lakes nations arrived at Fort St. Joseph on the shores of the Huron to join the British cause. The local British commander had only 50 redcoats under his charge, but empowered by his new allies, he swooped down into Michigan and besieged nearby Fort Mackinac. Unaware that the war had been declared, the American garrison surrendered without a fight. As Tecumseh's warriors took arms, the great chieftain himself was heading north to join the fray. At Brownstown Creek, he fell fiercely upon a supply convoy of 200 US soldiers, scattering them with only 25 warriors at his side. Following this string of humiliating defeats, Hull's nerve broke, and on August 7th, he retreated back into American territory to garrison in Fort Detroit, having accomplished little to nothing. Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson famously asserted that the acquisition of Canada this year will be a mere matter of marching, but this was no longer the reality. Tecumseh and his natives had delivered the British a fighting chance, and with that, the inspiration for the local Canadians to resist the conquest. But in truth, the war had just begun. There was much to do before Tecumseh's dream could be realized. It was at this point that the Shawnee chieftain's greatest ally enters the story. Major General Isaac Brock was a career soldier and a loyal British subject. In 1802, he was appointed a station in Lower Canada, where he eventually became head of the colonial army. Modern Canadians consider him a national hero, but in truth he resented his outpost. In comparison with the Napoleonic War, Canada was a sleepy and irrelevant sideshow. Nevertheless, Brock did his duty well. He reformed the provincial militia and bolstered the defences of forts on the American border. A few months before the war's outbreak, Brock was offered a posting in Europe. Despite his personal desires, he refused, believing he now had a duty to defend Canada against the invasion he knew was soon to come. On the night of August 13, 1812, Brock arrived at Fort Malden aboard a flotilla of ships by way of Lake Erie. Tecumseh was there waiting for him, and the two men were eager to see one another. Both had heard of the other's deeds, and both knew that they needed each other. Brock could not defend Canada without Tecumseh's aid, nor could Tecumseh retake his people's lands without British support. The two leaders soon met face to face and quickly developed a mutual respect. They agreed that only through a quick and decisive offensive could they hope to win this war. To that end, they resolved to attack Fort Detroit, the place where the bulk of American forces in the Northwest were stationed. It was risky, since the Allies knew they would be outnumbered 2-1. Most of Brock's officers were against it, yet the Major General would not relent. Tecumseh was impressed by his new partner's resolve, famously saying, "This is a man. A more sagacious and a more gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist." On the morning of the 15th of August, an allied force of Canadian militias, redcoats and natives made camp in Sandwich Town, opposite the river to the American-held Fort Detroit. Major General Brock commanded a force about 700 strong, while Tecumseh and his warriors numbered around 600. Meanwhile, General Hull had 2,500 men garrisoned inside his well-fortified walls, double the number of his opponent. Brock wrote a letter to his American adversary, demanding his immediate surrender, saying, "It is far from my inclination to join in a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be beyond my control the moment the contest commences." In truth, Tecumseh was no butcher, and in fact abhorred unnecessary killing, but through captured intelligence, he and Brock both knew that General Hull was terrified of native warriors, and that the fear of a savage massacre may be enough to break him. Yet still, no surrender came. The following night, Brock began to ferry his troops across the river. The British opened fire with their 3 heavy cannons and 2 mortars to cover the crossing. Hull ordered his 24-pounders to return fire. Neither side managed to inflict much damage upon the other, but on the morning of the 16th, a cannonball struck the fort's mess hall and killed 2 Americans. Upon crossing the river, Brock organized his troops into 2 rows a mile out from the fortress walls, boldly placing himself at the front of the line. An officer pleaded that he not expose himself so plainly, to which he replied, "Many here follow me from a feeling of personal regard. I will not ask them to go where I will not lead them." When news arrived that a force of 400 Ohio militiamen were arriving from his rear, Brock doubled down and marched his troops to the far side of the fort, opposite to the river. Meanwhile, Tecumseh and his warriors had quietly made the river crossing 5 miles south, filtering his men into a forest within view of the fort. Ingeniously, he paraded his men in circles, repeatedly having them pass through a gap in the tree line within view of the Americans, delivering ferocious war cries all the while. This created the illusion that there were far more natives at Detroit's gates than there actually were, and made the weight of an Indian massacre all the more real. By now, General Hull had been psychologically broken, with contemporary reports claiming he sat in a muted daze, saliva and tobacco dripping limply from his chin. Within his fort there were women and children, including his very own daughter and grandchild. The man had never had the will of a soldier, and the mind games of Brock and Tecumseh had broken him. After only a few hours of siege, the gates opened, and Hull's own son rode out, bearing a white flag. Fort Detroit had surrendered. It was a stunning defeat for the Americans. The largest garrison in the northern United States had surrendered without a fight. 2,493 soldiers were taken captive by a force barely half their number. Tecumseh had done his part and delivered the British a great victory. Now it was time for his imperial allies to help him push deeper into American territory and help him establish a homeland for his people. Unfortunately for him, this would never come to pass. The United States was determined to avenge their humiliation at Detroit, and thus launched an offensive upon Queenston Heights, managing to capture the town. This provoked Brock to rally a force of militiamen from nearby York and some native Mohawk allies to once more drive the Americans from Canadian soil. It was in this engagement where the Major General met his end. He charged up the heights with his men, wearing a silk sash given to him by Tecumseh. This made him a conspicuous target, and as he ran up the hill, he was shot fatally through the chest. 300 Mohawk warriors jumped into the fray, holding off a much larger American army until British reinforcements arrived. Queenston was retaken, and nearly 1,000 Americans were captured or killed. Despite this, with Brock dead, the native Confederacy had now lost its only reliable ally. Meanwhile, an old foe of Tecumseh had come to assume command of the American forces in the northwest, none other than William Henry Harrison, the conqueror of Prophetstown. Unlike his predecessor Hull, Harrison was a natural leader and a decisive soldier. His first act was to construct a bastion along the Maumee River, which he called Fort Meigs. From there he planned to strike upwards and retake Detroit. Meanwhile, the Governor-General of Canada had promoted an officer by the name of Henry Proctor to lead the British Army due to Isaac Brock's untimely death. Proctor and Tecumseh went on the southwards offensive. In January of 1813, the native British forces encountered an expeditionary platoon of mounted Kentucky riflemen sallying north from Fort Meigs. They clashed on a battlefield outside the borough of Frenchtown. For once, the Americans were outnumbered and suffered a resounding defeat. Nearly 500 Kentuckians were killed in the fighting, the highest American casualty count of any battle in the war, and yet another 500 were captured. The American prisoners were put on a forced march back to Fort Malden for detainment. Native warriors began taking liberties with their captives, robbing and killing the injured, and cutting down any who would not keep pace with the slog. Tecumseh himself had left before the battle's end, and was not present to see the massacre. He abhorred needless death, so when he caught wind of the prisoners' fate, he was outraged. Confronting Proctor, he demanded to know why the British general would allow such a thing, to which Proctor snidely replied that Tecumseh's natives were impossible to control. At this, the chieftain replied temperously, "Begone! You are unfit to command. Go and put on petticoats." From there, cracks continued to form in Tecumseh's tenuous alliance with the British. With Brock, the chieftain had built a strong rapport, but he had no such respect for Proctor, who refused to fight the war on the natives' terms, as Brock had. Meanwhile, the Americans would remember the massacre at Frenchtown, their slain prisoners would become martyrs, and the event became a rallying cry for the rest of the war. Sure enough, the tides began to turn. In the spring of 1813, Tecumseh convinced a begrudging Proctor into launching a joint assault upon Fort Meigs. Twice a force of 1,200 natives and 900 British soldiers laid siege to the fort, but twice Harrison managed to repel them, despite suffering heavy casualties. As more Americans fell into British captivity during these battles, Tecumseh continued to prevent massacres as much as he could. It is because of this that many Americans to this day regard him with the respect befitting a noble foe. The failing relationship between Tecumseh and his allies was further exacerbated when the United States won a decisive naval engagement in September of 1813. The Battle of Put-in Bay put the entirety of Lake Erie in American hands and cut off British supply lines, forcing them to abandon Fort Malden and Fort Detroit, thereby erasing all the victories won by Tecumseh and Brock a year earlier. With winter looming, General Proctor retreated eastward, banking on the fact that Harrison would not pursue him through the winter snows. This enraged Tecumseh, for the Shawnee chieftain still wanted to go on the offensive. He felt betrayed. After all, he had delivered the British several victories in their war, only to receive no aid in return for it. As it turned out, Proctor's gamble was incorrect. Harrison was all too willing to risk a winter campaign to press his advantage. After retaking Fort Detroit, the American general marched eastwards to pursue the British forces. Still, Proctor continued to withdraw, much to the disgust of Tecumseh, who now realized that his unreliable ally could not be further removed from the gallantry and bravery of Brock. Reluctantly, the Shawnee took his warriors and joined the British retreat. But soon he had had enough. Realizing there was no end to Proctor's timidity, Tecumseh stood before the general and put his foot in the earth, issuing him an ultimatum. The British would withdraw no further, or the alliance between them and his native confederacy was over. In declaring this, Tecumseh had said choice words that would go down in history. "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it be His will, we wish to leave our bones upon them." With his hand being forced, Proctor agreed to face Harrison's army. He chose to make his stand on the banks of the Canadian River Thames near Moraviantown, a village of Christian Delawares. Proctor's 900 men lined themselves in rows perpendicular to the river. Exhausted and starving from their forced march, the Redcoats were in no state to fight. Tecumseh stationed his warriors in a black ash swamp to the British right, where they would have ample cover and could flank the approaching American army. The emboldened Grand Chieftain personally shook the hand of each British officer before rejoining his men. Before long, the Americans were in sight. Harrison's force was imposing, nearly 4,000 strong. They more than doubled the numbers of the British and natives combined. Proctor had made no attempt to build earthworks to fortify his position, and so the plains between him and the Americans remained entirely uncontested. Harrison knew that the best way to break his enemy was to move fast and strike hard, much like he had done at Prophetstown 2 years earlier. The American general kept the bulk of his militia and infantry in reserve, and organized a center column of mounted Kentucky riflemen to barrel down towards the British line. Tecumseh and his warriors opened fire from the swamp, but were unable to stop the cavalry from thundering into their redcoat allies. This devastating charge broke the British morale. Gripped by panic, they broke formation and scattered, offering only a token resistance through disorganized and scattered gunfire. General Proctor fled the field with 250 of his men, while the remaining 600 British soldiers were either captured or cut down. When Tecumseh was young, he had taken an oath to never again flee in the face of battle. Even now, with his allies abandoning him and outnumbered 8-1 by his enemy, he would uphold that oath. Entrenched deep in the swamps, the natives fought on without British aid. Harrison ordered his Kentucky cavalrymen to break their lines, but their initial charge was cut down by a fusillade of native gunfire. From there, the battle devolved into a drawn-out shootout, with both sides trading fire amidst the cover of the swampy thicket. It is here, in a battlefield of smoky air and muddy mire, that the story of Tecumseh ends. As the chaotic shootout continued, an American soldier managed to train his sights on the proud Shawnee chieftain and shoot him through the chest. Tecumseh was killed immediately upon the impact. It didn't take long for news of Tecumseh's death to spread among the native warriors. Deeply demoralized by this, and afeared by the rest of Harrison's army descending upon them, they fled the battlefield and scattered. The Battle of the Thames was a decisive victory for the Americans, and spelled the end of the great native coalition. Tecumseh had been the glue that bound them together. No other warrior among them had as much respect from so many diverse tribes. After the engagement at Moravian Town, many individual chieftains surrendered to Governor Harrison and returned to their homes, beholden to the will of the United States. There would be no more United Native Front, and no more attempts to form a united indigenous nation on North American soil. The confederacy that Tecumseh had spent so many years building in life inevitably dissolved with his death. The War of 1812 would rage on for another 2 years after Tecumseh's passing, but native warriors no longer played a major role. Both British and American armies scored later victories, with the British sacking the capital of Washington and the Americans winning an iconic engagement at New Orleans. The war ended in stalemate. The British had successfully defended their territory, while the Americans had asserted their sovereignty. Canada would not be annexed, and America would no longer have their economic and territorial interests imposed upon. In the end, the only true losers of the War of 1812 were the indigenous tribes of the continent. During peace talks, the British had originally negotiated to establish a native nation, albeit only to create a buffer state to block further American expansion. Naturally, the Americans outright denied this proposal. Realizing they did not have the leverage to enforce such a thing, the British quickly abandoned the notion. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed in December of 1814, no provisions existed to stem the tide of American westward expansion, and expand they did. Without a strong leader like Tecumseh to bind them, the indigenous peoples of the American continent were largely helpless to combat the flood of settlers that came to take their lands. The Red Stick Muskogees who had declared for Tecumseh fought on for a time, engaging the Americans in the Deep South, but they too were eventually defeated by future President Andrew Jackson in a massacre at Horseshoe Bend. In the end, the story of Tecumseh is a tragic tale. A man of remarkable charisma, integrity, bravery and strength, who spent his whole life fighting for independence and unity, only to have it all taken away upon his death. Even his greatest foe in William Henry Harrison had remarked that this brave warrior had the makings of an emperor, and it is easy to wonder what great things he could have done if only he had lived a little longer. Nevertheless, Tecumseh's memory is alive and well today. To the Americans he was a noble opponent, to Canadians the saviour of their nation, but to the indigenous peoples of North America he is and always will be, above all things, an icon of resistance. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.